Welcome to the TribCast. I'm Eleanor Klibanoff, thrilled to be joined this week by, as always, Editor-in-Chief Matthew Watkins. How you doing, Matthew?
Doing all right. Yeah.
We are very excited for both the theme of today's episode, where we'll be talking about a big upcoming Senate race in Texas, and especially excited about our guest, our former friend turned mortal enemy, Patrick Svitek. Patrick, how are
Thanks
you?
for letting me come back on. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Patrick is currently a reporter on the Washington Post's politics breaking news team. Most of you probably know him from his 9-year stint covering politics for us here at the Texas Tribune. Patrick remains, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, the most prolific Texas Tribune reporter in history.
That's probably true. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
More
don't have
bylines than
numbers to back
anyone.
that up,
Yeah,
but I'm going to say yes.
Last year, he left us for the Washington Post, but we're thrilled to have him back here on the TribCast. Patrick, before we jump into the race, what do you miss most about Texas? What can we send to you in DC? If we could transplant one thing from Texas to DC, what would you have?
Oh man, just HEB in general, probably. There's specific products I could call out, but yeah, there's the grocery stores in DC do not compare to HEB in general, I would say. So that's one thing. And then there's plenty of restaurants and taco places that I could list off for you, especially coming from San Antonio to DC.
Saw that coming a mile away.
Yeah.
Patrick, you'd be sad to know about all the coffee shops closing around our office. It's dark times out here in Congress.
Yeah. I will say I lived in DC I went to college in DC and lived there for a while after, and maybe it's changed since, but when I lived there, at least the Tex-Mex was egregiously bad. Very few options.
There's serviceable Mexican food to Tex-Mex, at least in the DC proper area. In parts of Maryland, there's really good Mexican food, I would say, outside of DC. But in the district itself, yeah, you gotta put in some work to find the good places.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you are missing HEB and Tex-Mex maybe more than the Texas legislature, which we are knee deep in right now. But we are going to look ahead to a forthcoming political showdown, potentially one of the biggest political battles in recent Texas memory, as longtime incumbent Senator John Cornyn faces down the insurgent arm of the Republican Party in the physical form of Texas Attorney General Paxton. This is shaping up to be a vicious, expensive primary in which Texas's Republican infighting will be laid out on the national stage for all to witness. Feels a bit like, when someone comes over to your family's house and sees your family fighting. It's a little embarrassing, but we're, going to be a big.
People know what to expect when they come visit our family.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think Texas is hiding it. They're the family having the fight at the
front lawn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Patrick, you've covered both of these figures for a long time. Let's start with Cornyn and tell us a little bit about, John Cornyn as a character and sort of what his profile looks like coming into this race.
Sure. Well, I guess, from the perspective in Washington, I mean, he's coming into this reelection campaign after coming up short in something that he has long wanted to do, which is lead Senate Republicans. He narrowly lost the Senate Majority Leader race to John Thune from South Dakota right after the November election in 2024. For, I think, years before that, he had made clear that was something that he had wanted to run for if if Mitch McConnell ever stepped aside from that leadership position. He made a good run for it. And, I forgot what the final count was, but it wasn't like a blowout. And so it was kind of a disappointing loss for him, but he made pretty clear right after that he planned to run for re-election, telling reporters that in DC, and then officially launched his re-election campaign in March. And for now, it seems like he has a lot of fight left in him, or at least he's trying to project the image that he has a lot of fight left in him. I mean, he is coming out of the gates swinging at Paxton, which sure, I guess the generous interpretation is it shows he has a lot of fight left in him, but it also shows, the very vulnerable position that he's in this primary, that he feels the need to go negative on Paxton so quickly. And so that's kind of, I think, John Cornyn summed up over at least the recent several months.
Yeah. And then, Matthew, I'll give you the tougher question, which is, how would you summarize Ken Paxton?
How would I summarize Ken Paxton? So Ken Paxton, of course, has been Attorney General since 2015. He is a controversial and a figure who brings up a lot of passion on both sides, and has for that time. I think people view him as very closely aligned with Donald Trump. Famously filed a lawsuit in 2020 in seeking to overturn the election results. He's been very aggressive in pursuing causes favored by the kind of hardline right of Texas that can range from anti-abortion initiatives targeting what he perceives to be as voter fraud, and a lot of sort of like social issues, things related to trans kids, all that kind of stuff. If you see it being talked about on Fox News, Ken Paxton has probably filed a lawsuit related to it in the court. He, of course, also has carried with him a lot of ethical baggage. Famously, was under indictment for a long part of his early part of his tenure because he was accused of securities fraud. That case has since kind of gone away. And then, more recently, many of his top lieutenants resigned and accused him of bribery. That in case was investigated by the FBI, but we learned recently that just before Trump took over, the FBI, the Department of Justice, dropped that case. And so, he has those close ties with the base. He has those close ties with the Trump administration. There are definitely people in the Republican Party who try to keep him at arm's length, though, because of some of those other kind of areas of baggage in the world.
That was a very phenomenal recounting. You left out one major chapter other than that, which
okay.
is he was impeached.
Right. Of course.
Yes.
Yes.
He was not unlike, our president right now was impeached by the House, the Texas House of Representatives, and then after having a lengthy trial in the Senate, the Texas Senate voted to acquit him and restore him to his role. So other than that, that's really,
so
I
left out
summarized it in,
maybe the most important thing, but
but you got all the rest of the details. I mean, Patrick, there's like long been the joke about attorneys general, like not just in Texas, but nationally, right? That it stands for like aspiring governor. It is often a jumping point to more, to higher office. How surprised are you to see Paxton getting into this race? Like, how did we get here with Paxton challenging Cornyn?
Not surprised at all. I mean, Paxton had telegraphed for months that maybe even over a year that he would maybe one day be interested in challenging Cornyn. Cornyn has been one of the few statewide elected Texas Republicans who has at least been blunt in observing Paxton's legal challenges. It's not like Cornyn has necessarily been a vocal critic of Paxton's legal challenges, but among other statewide elected Republicans, they've been largely happy to just kind of look the other way and try to remain neutral as Paxton has encountered all these other, all these legal and ethical issues. So Cornyn has stood out, I think, for at least acknowledging or expressing some concern about the legal and ethical issues that Paxton has had. And he's gotten sharper over the years. There was obviously that, tweet from Cornyn to Paxton, I think last year, where he said it's hard to run from prison, Ken. So clearly he went from expressing concern to throwing some actual political jabs. But Cornyn has stood out, I think, in that regard. And I think there's some real personal animosity between these two men. And I think that's what's keeping Cornyn going here a little bit. I mentioned earlier that Cornyn seems to be, showing some real fight from the outset of this race. I think that that's inspired by a little bit of personal animus, toward Paxton. And, even though in this day and age, in the Trump era, I think Cornyn probably feels like he can't say this out loud because of Trump's own scandals and the general tolerance for scandals inside the GOP. But I think Cornyn believes that the Texas GOP should be embarrassed about Paxton. And so I think that's kind of what personally may be keeping Cornyn chugging along in this case, even though it looks like he's in the final, he's in the latter years of his political career.
I should just pause and acknowledge that for those of us who cover Texas politics, who are involved in, the media world, this is just delightful, right? Whether or not
It's
we,
it's cotton candy.
yeah,
Yeah.
we may not have a dog in the race, but we love interesting and exciting races. And I would say this one is probably the highest profile Republican primary in the state since maybe 2010, when Kay Bailey Hutchison, then a sitting senator, I believe, challenged the incumbent governor, Rick Perry, in what everyone was super excited about, this being this huge kind of heavyweight fight. In that race, it didn't really turn out to be that much of a fight. It turned out to be something of a pummeling. Rick Perry winning by more than 20 percentage points in that race. But I think we see this as two people who loom very heavily over Texas politics, going right after each other. Whether Cornyn would agree with this framing or not, I think a lot of people are viewing it as sort of the more traditional Republican, the one who has been, in leadership in the Senate for a very long time. Was kind of around before we saw this dramatic shift to the right in the state Republican Party and the Republican Party in general, versus the sort of new type of Republican, the one who really ties the line close to Trump, who is, always kind of scrapping for a fight, and frankly is like less concerned about the traditional norms and rules that govern politics. And I think we're going to watch this, and I think a lot of people are going to frame this as a sort of fight over, the future of the Republican Party in Texas.
And in many ways, like, Ken Paxton has been the standard bearer for that movement, right? Not just in that he is the most, and I wouldn't even necessarily say he necessarily is like sort of the most extreme in that side of the party, but he's certainly the most vocal, the most. I mean, we saw this in like judicial races in the last election, where Attorney General Paxton was very unhappy with a ruling and said basically, I'm going to go get, the judges I want. It was pretty open about that. Like, I don't think he would dispute that framing. And with the Court of Criminal Appeals, unseated 3 people, put on judges, in at least 2 cases who were very closely allied with him. So he seems pretty, in many ways, I think he's been preparing for this fight for a long time. And, it's going to be a big national um, route. I mean, I am curious though, Patrick, what is your sense of how outside of Texas, maybe, and even within, the Texas GOP, how much appetite is there for this big, bloody, vicious, potentially expensive primary in Texas, a state that, otherwise, I think people think Cornyn maybe could, walk into another term if he wanted to, if he didn't face a major challenge.
Sure. I mean, I think from Republican, operatives in DC who are aligned with Cornyn or sympathetic to Cornyn, they view this as a waste of time and money during a midterm cycle where, historically the trends are against them, but they do have a 3-seat majority in the Senate and some opportunities to grow that majority. And so I think even Cornyn himself has voiced this concern. It's obviously a self-serving concern, but, the concern that we're going to spend tens of millions, over $100 million on a statewide primary in Texas, when at least some of that money could be going to trying to flip open Senate seats in places like Michigan, New Hampshire, Minnesota. So I think that's the pro, Cornyn view in DC. But obviously, the Senate Republican Conference has become just more and more Trumpy. It's still not as Trumpy as House Republicans are. Obviously, House Republicans are a very pro-Trump, rowdy bunch, but you have seen the remaking of the Senate, Republican conference into definitely a more pro-Trump body. And for people who want to see it continue in this direction, this is a very pivotal fight in that trend.
And how much of this comes down to the big man himself, the endorsement from President Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say earlier, I mean, we could spend hours talking about all the different dynamics of this race and the pros and cons of each candidate. But really, I think this is going to turn on what Trump ultimately chooses to do in this race. I think he weighed in on this race for the first time publicly last weekend. He told reporters that he, knows and respects both men, or knows and likes both men, but would make an endorsement at, quote, the appropriate time. Paxton himself has said, I think in one of his post-announcement interviews, that he doesn't expect Trump to endorse until closer to the primary in March 2026. So right now, the vibes are clearly that Trump is not itching to jump into this race. And I think for Paxton, one of his immediate challenges in this race is to try to keep out a credible third candidate, whether that's someone like Wesley Hunt, the congressman from Houston. I know Beth Van Dyne congresswoman from the Dallas area. Her name also gets tossed around. So Paxton, I think he's got some short-term tasks he needs to fulfill, and then some, in terms of keeping out a third credible candidate, and then maybe some medium-term tasks in terms of trying to lock down Trump endorsement or continue to keep Trump out of the race, which I'm sure he would view as a win in a way as well. So that's, I think, what Paxton's to-do list is right now.
Yeah, you kind of contrast this race to the lieutenant governor's race, right, where Dan Patrick announced re-election and Trump immediately endorsed him, right? We at least don't have that situation in Texas. It seems like Cornyn has made some efforts in the past year or so to sort of mend some fences with some of the people in the grassroots who have fought against him. There's kind of this famous moment in the 2022 state Republican convention when Cornyn spoke on stage and was essentially booed off stage. We had an article from Matthew Choi a few months ago talking about how he's kind of tried to repair that relationship. He has voted with Trump. He backed most, if not all, of Trump's nominees this year and early in Trump's term. So, can he kind of keep that relationship friendly enough to keep Trump out of the race, I think is definitely an interesting question.
Right. I mean, and we've talked about this on the state level, like, the thin, fine, like distinctions we draw between different candidates, right? Cornyn, as Matthew has reported on for us, like voted with Trump's agenda 92% of the time during President Trump's first term, and supported all of his nominees. Like, certainly Cornyn has been very aligned with President Trump. He is, I think, a little haunted by, I believe it was in 2023 when he said, ahead of the 2024 election, that Trump's time had passed him by. He has done a lot since then to sort of try to work his way back in. He posted a photo on X like a couple weeks ago before Paxton got in the race of him like reading The Art of the Deal, which I felt was
Hmm.
a little on the nose personally, but people like it. So yeah, I think certainly a lot of, like you said, a lot of this speculation really comes down to one man.
Yeah, the other thing people really hit Cornyn on was his involvement in really the only gun safety bill to pass the Senate in recent years. This was in 2022 after the Uvalde shooting. It was a bill that increased funding for mental health and incentivized states to pass laws that keep guns out of the hands of people who are found by the courts to be threats to themselves or others. Those are, known as red flag laws. I think a lot of people pointed at that and said, this is a very, very, very modest gun safety law, but anytime you pass anything that can be called a gun safety law, you're going to engender kind of pushback from the Republican right, and that indeed did happen. I'm sure we'll see that be brought up during during the primary this year.
Absolutely. There's another person in this, little family feud we've got going on, which is Senator Ted Cruz. I mean, Patrick, what do you anticipate? Are we going to see an endorsement from him? Does that endorsement carry much weight? And sort of, what do you think his role will be in all of this?
Yeah, I think Cruz will probably stay out unless Trump gets in and a real front runner emerges by the filing deadline. But I think Cruz otherwise probably has, no political incentive to get deeply involved in this primary with a formal endorsement or campaigning for anyone. Again, unless it's clear that Trump is going to back someone, and then that candidate kind of pulls away with it, whether it's Cornyn or Paxton or even another candidate. So Cruz is staying out of it, and it's of course it's very politically awkward for him because he's had this very fragile alliance, or I don't even know if I'd call it an alliance, a relationship with Cornyn over the years. I mean, he previously declined to endorse Cornyn in his I'm trying to remember in one of his last competitive primaries. But then Cornyn did campaign for Cruz in one of his hard fought reelection campaigns. And so, Cruz has a lot of, I think, it's important to know Cruz has a lot of overlapping relationships here when it comes to elected officials, donors, grassroots activists. And so I don't think it's necessarily him declining to endorse Cornyn is necessarily, should be read as an explicit de facto endorsement of Paxton. But, Cruz is now Cruz has now served quite a long time in Texas, has built up a lot of relationships in Washington, in Austin and Houston. And so Cruz just is deeply, I think, many political conflicts of interest in this race.
Yeah, it's an interesting he's sort of in an interesting role. I mean, certainly when he came into the Senate was such a seen as sort of, I think, in many ways the standard bearer of this more insurgent movement, and now they're, I wouldn't say the movement has like moved beyond him necessarily, but like if we had a Senator Paxton, I think Senator Paxton would maybe take up the role of like a flamethrower in Texas's flamethrower in chief.
Yeah. And for, for what it's worth, Paxton is doing all he can to kind of butter up Cruz for a potential endorsement maybe down the line. In every media interview that I've seen from Paxton since he launched his campaign, he, constantly says we have a conservative fighter in Ted Cruz. We need another conservative fighter in that other Senate seat. And so, that's a contrast that really helps, Paxton make the case, but it could also, try to lay the groundwork for a Cruz endorsement down the line if Cruz does decide to get off the sidelines.
So knowing we were going to talk about this today, I sat down and sort of tried to prepare in my mind the case for and against Cornyn.
Give it to us.
Can I do this and get y'all to react to it?
Please.
All right. So I'm going to do the Paxton case first, right? It's Paxton, the polls pretty consistently show, is the more popular politician in Texas. The most recent Texas Politics poll showed a 30% approval rating for Cornyn, 37% disapprove, so minus 7 percentage points there. Paxton's approval rating was 37%, 34 disapprove, so a plus 3%, right? Both have some kind of no opinion, or unknown type people there. But among GOP voters, the difference is even bigger. Paxton, a plus 35% net favorability, according to a U of H poll in February. Cornyn, a plus 18 net favorability. That's for people who have voted or should be expected to vote in the GOP primary next year. And then, as we are sort of already talked about, Paxton just represents more of what the Republican Party is right now than John Cornyn does. He seems to be the type of politician that people in that party want right now, compared to the more traditional John Cornyn. What else am I missing there? What am I missing in the Paxton case?
I think that anything else on the I think
that was the case for Paxton.
That's
case for Paxton, right?
Yeah.
I will say, like, and then I do want to hear the case for Cornyn, but like we sort of saw a preview of this, right? When it turned Paxton was challenged by George P. Bush, right? Like a little bit more of that, slightly more old school versus, and that was when Paxton was in like the heat of the his legal challenges, and he won by quite a healthy margin. So certainly there's a case to be made for voters love him.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So let me then.
Well, I think the big caveat there is, and I think for those of us who follow politics closely, that 22 primary and primary runoff was especially frustrating and kind of inconclusive because he was running against a Bush. And in Republican circles, primary electorate circles, the Bush name is just the beginning and end of conversation for some voters. And so you're really looking at that 22 primary because of the opponent. You really wonder if that is actually an accurate gauge of what a real race against Paxton looks like. Just because, again, for some Republican primary voters, they just hear the name Bush and they just plug their ears more or less. So it's always interesting to think about how instructive that race really was.
Yeah, and additionally, Paxton was the incumbent, right? And in this race, Paxton will not be in the incumbent.
Exactly.
But also just the history of Republican primaries. I mean, Cornyn actually, now I'm moving into the case for Cornyn here, but has a better history, right? That 2022 primary, Ken Paxton, in the first round of voting, won 42.7%. which means that more than half of the primary voters voted against Ken Paxton in that race. Those same voters who are presumably going to be voting in this election right now. Let's talk about Cornyn's last 3 primaries. He faced challengers in each of those. In 2008, he got 81% of the vote against Larry Kilgore. In 2014, he got 59% of the vote against Steve Stockman, a former congressman who pulled in 19% of the vote. So Cornyn won that race by 40%. In 2020, he got 76% of the vote. Admittedly, none of those were as strong of opponents as George P. Bush, but I mean, those are resounding victories, something that Ken Paxton decidedly did not get in the first round of voting the last time. In addition to that, the argument against Paxton in that primary was all his ethical concerns. There seemed to be some success in that, but also just Cornyn's going to have a lot more money, and that's going to be the top race in this race. He is going to be able to really message those concerns in this race. Since that race, also, Paxton was impeached. 60 of the 85 Republican members voted to impeach him in the House. Admittedly, he then
was
acquitted in the Senate, but that's notable. And people will say, like, okay, but yeah, then the next Republican primary for the House members was a bloodbath, right? But when you kind of break down the numbers, it's a little bit more complicated than that because, of course, Ken Paxton was going against the Republican members who voted to impeach him, but Greg Abbott was also going against the Republican members who voted against him on the voucher bill. And if you look at the numbers, Greg Abbott actually seemed to have a lot more success there, right? So there were 16 Republican members running for re-election who voted against school vouchers in the 2024 primaries. 9 of them lost their seats, so more than half.
Right.
There were 40 Republicans who were running for re-election and voted for school vouchers, but also voted to impeach. So that basically means that Paxton was going against them, but Greg Abbott was not. Only 5 of those 40 lost their primaries. That's 13%.
Okay.
So what people on Cornyn's case, who are on Cornyn's side, would say is that Paxton actually did not demonstrate an ability to be that effective in affecting the Republican primaries. It was Greg Abbott who proved to be incredibly effective. And so there is all this record of Paxton actually not doing that well in these primaries over the last couple of years. Evaluate that case.
Patrick, thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I've told anybody who will listen, in the past year that I don't think nearly as many state House Republicans would have lost their primaries if the state House would have just gone ahead and passed school vouchers last session and gotten that over with. I mean, in fact, Dade Phelan would probably still be speaker in my view if that had happened, because I really believe that the majority of those races where incumbents lost, the primary factor was definitely the opposition, the money, the campaigning that was brought against them because of their position on school vouchers. Paxton did not, in these races that he targeted, he did not bring nearly as much, or in some cases, any outside money to the table in the way that Abbott was able to bring his own campaign funds and then outside campaign funds to the table in races that were being targeted for school over the school vouchers vote. So I agree that Paxton was not a driving factor, or impeachment, I don't think, was a driving factor in the eventual outcome of a lot of those primaries where House incumbents lost.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, I think forever the question right now in Texas Republican politics, at least, right, which is like, we have this extremely loud, extremely sort of media dominant group of insurgent Republicans, grassroots Republicans, whatever you want to call them. But how effective are they, right? I mean, they didn't win the speaker's vote. They didn't win. Like, there's been a number of several of them, who voted to impeach, maintain their seats, to your point. So in some ways, like, to go back to where we started, this is a question of like, this Ken Paxton led insurgent movement is very loud. They're very dominant. They're very, what we talk about a lot. This will be a test of like, well, how much of the electorate do they have on their side?
I think, to be clear, I think impeachment was very helpful to Paxton's personal narrative, especially going into this primary challenge to Cornyn. But if the question is like, how determinative was that in the last election cycle with those incumbent losses, I don't think it was factor number one.
Can we talk about the impact of this race on the general election?
Yes.
We don't actually know, of course, who, if any prominent Democrat is going to choose to run for this office. I'm sure they'll find someone. Whether it'll be a quality candidate, I think, remains to be seen, right? But I mean, I remember in 2024, all my sort of non-politically focused friends would be like, is Colin Allred like actually going to win the U.S. Senate race? And I was like, no, he's not going to win the U.S. Senate race. And if you were hoping for a Democrat to win a statewide race, I would tell them, here's the path for that to happen. It's Donald Trump winning in 2024, creating a then midterm election that inevitably goes backlash against the Republican who won the previous year. And then Ken Paxton successfully primarying John Cornyn in that race. I thought at that time that was actually maybe a credible path for a Democratic victory. I was not expecting Trump to trounce Biden at the amount,
to win bigly.
Exactly. In Texas that he did. So I kind of maybe regret telling that to people, but I'm curious what you think, Patrick, about how vulnerable might Ken Paxton be in a general election in the political climate that we might see in 2026.
Yeah, I mean, I think the polling bears out that, or at least my gut feeling is that he's more vulnerable to political competition in the general election than Cornyn is. I don't know if that's, the hottest take,
Yeah.
but I still think he enters the general election as the favorite, given the political moment that Texas is in, with the state, appearing to get redder in statewide elections. I think Democrats in Texas are always kind of self-negotiating over what the best opportunity is. It's like, oh, if we just get, this nominee after a bruising battle versus this nominee, maybe we can win it. And sure, like I just acknowledged, I think he would be he would create a better opportunity for them, but I still think he would be the favorite in that general election.
Yeah, I think that's probably the reality is, there's not a really as much as that path I think probably did make sense like before the election. The I don't know that the backlash that I'm sure some Republicans are preparing for in the midterms is going to make it to Texas. Yeah.
The other fun thing about this is now we get a primary for attorney general as well, right?
My favorite thing to talk about.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And there are already people in that race. John Bash, a prominent conservative attorney who has done some work for Elon Musk. You've got Mays Middleton, prominent senator. I saw that Joan Huffman, another member of the Senate, told Brad Johnson from the Texan today that she's seriously considering a run. I think Brian Hughes, another senator,
Yeah.
has come up a lot. Mitch Little, who represented Ken
Certainly.
Paxton in that race. We could have a really crowded and interesting primary for that race too.
You talk about like things political reporters love. It's like, sure, we'd love a Cornyn-Paxton battle. We love a crowded attorney general's race where everyone gets to sort of litigate what they think the attorney general should do, what they think see that role as. I mean, Texas's attorney general plays such an outsized role in national conservative politics, which has not always been the case. I won't belabor this, but 25 years ago, when John Cornyn, the first Republican attorney general since Reconstruction in modern Texas history, before that, the attorney general's, was basically a bureaucratic workhorse, and now we have, this conservative, very ideological office, and I think we can safely assume that the Republican candidate, at least in that election, will be cut from the same cloth.
Yeah, there's just a lot of pent up ambition in the Republican Party right now because there's a lot of people who've been holding their office for a very long time, and other people who see themselves as a governor someday or a
Right.
statewide official someday. Seeing that, of course, the comptroller's race, there will also be something there because of Glenn Hager going to A&M. So it's going to be a very after honestly like a pretty boring
Yeah,
2024
I know.
election. Like
Yeah,
this is going to be a fun one in 2026.
certainly, and yeah.
On the AG race too, I'm not ready to, you had mentioned Democrats in the Senate race earlier. I'm not ready to say that Democrats may have a better shot in the AG race, but I do think the dynamics going into that general election could be a lot different than the dynamics going into the general election for Senate. This Republican primary for AG could produce a nominee who no one really knows statewide in a general electorate, right? And so, especially compared to a Paxton or a Cornyn entering a general election, they have pretty broad statewide name ID. But this is just an example, but say like Joan Huffman is the Republican nominee for AG, not a very well-known name statewide. And so it'll be interesting to see if that Republican primary produces someone who is able to make it through the fire of the party's primary, but then is like pretty unknown statewide to a general electorate.
And I'm sure, Democrats will try their hardest to make this about like abortion enforcement and everything like that,
Right.
an issue that they've not really been able to wield effectively up until now.
Right. And like I'm no political consultant, but I do think like Democrats do sort of have an opportunity to say like the attorney general's office is supposed to be doing all this bureaucratic stuff. Like it is not supposed to be this ideological, weapon and like restoring, a little bit of like we'll just enforce child support and we'll do Medicaid fraud and we'll do, crime victims compensation and like leave the partisan litigation to private litigants.
Yeah, we'll see how that
I don't
how
know
that works for
that
them.
voters love. Here's what I know:
I'm trying to
voters
keep the
love
straight face over
boring.
here.
They love bureaucracy. They love, yeah, particularly in Texas, they love.
Yeah.
We're not going to do Trump's bidding. That works every time. Well, we will be watching all of that and all of this as well on what promises to be a very, very exciting run up to March 2026, which is actually kind of a long time away. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate having you here.
We miss you, Patrick.
Thanks for having me. Send tortillas.
Yes, that's it for today. You can find all episodes of the TribCast on YouTube or wherever you find your podcasts. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share the podcast on all of your platforms. If you'd like to get in touch with the team, you can reach us at tribcast@texastribune.org. Our producers are Rob Avila and Chris Svoboda. Our theme music is composed by Rob, and we will see you next week.